In Hitler's vision of the Third Reich, everything had its place, especially women. Their roles weren't just defined, they were engineered. From the cradle to the kitchen, from the wedding altar to the nursery, womanhood became state property. There was a blueprint for the perfect German woman, obedient, pure, fertile, and silent. Not just a wife or mother, but a servant of ideology, a tool of control wrapped in the language of love. So was it love? Was it loyalty? Was it control? Or was it all of it, twisted into something far more dangerous? This is the story of the women and the brides of the Third Reich, a story of obedience disguised as honor, of lives scripted by power, and of a fate no one would envy. Before the rise of the Third Reich, German women were experiencing a period of unprecedented change. The years of the Weimar Republic saw a surge in female independence, both socially and politically. Women gained the right to vote, entered universities in growing numbers, and began to take up roles in journalism, medicine, law, and the arts. In cities like Berlin, the image of the new woman emerged. She was short-haired, stylish, sexually liberated, and financially independent. She smoked in cafes, danced in nightclubs, and spoke openly about politics and desire. To conservative eyes, she was thrilling and deeply unsettling. When Adolf Hitler imagined the future of the German Reich, he didn't picture women in courtrooms or behind desks. He didn't dream of doctors in white coats or scholars in lecture halls. In his vision, women had one task, and it began in the home. The ideal woman, according to the Nazi worldview, didn't lead, didn't question, and didn't belong in the public sphere. She belonged in the kitchen, in the nursery, in the quiet corners of the home. That was where the new Germany would be built, not through politics or industry, but through obedience, motherhood, and silence. Hitler believed that women were naturally softer than men, more emotional and more gentle. He saw these qualities not as weaknesses, but as proof that they were unfit for the struggles of public life. The modern woman of the 1920s, educated, independent, outspoken, was to him a threat. She represented everything he thought was wrong in the Weimar Republic. He viewed the idea of women's rights as a lie, a trick designed to lead society away from its natural structure. To Hitler, this push for equality was not progress, it was sabotage. He called it a Marxist plot, part of a grand conspiracy to unravel the German nation from within. True strength, he claimed, came not from speeches or politics, but from sacrifice, and for women that meant giving themselves completely to the family and to the Führer. The woman he praised was not one who stood out, but who disappeared into duty. She was expected to be fertile and faithful, not curious or critical. Her highest honor was to bear children for the Reich. Her deepest loyalty was not to her husband, nor to her own parents, nor even to her children. Her loyalty belonged to Hitler. He stood above them all. Even love was expected to bow before him. After shaping the image of the ideal woman, silent, loyal, fertile, the Nazi regime moved from words to action. Ideology was not enough. Belief had to be turned into behavior, and behavior in the Third Reich was something that could be taught, rehearsed, and perfected. That was the purpose behind one of the most chilling, yet strangely delicate institutions of Nazi Germany, the Reich Bride Schools. These schools, known as Reich Brautschulen, were created to train young women to become not just good wives, but perfect wives for the Reich, for the SS, and ultimately for Hitler himself. The project was launched in the mid-1930s under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, Gertrude Scholz-Klink, the highest-ranking woman in the Nazi state. Together they designed a program that combined tradition with fanaticism, domesticity with indoctrination. It was not enough for women to be loyal in spirit, they had to live that loyalty every hour of every day, beginning in the home. But not every girl could attend. Before they were allowed into the bride schools, young women had to prove their racial worth. The regime demanded documents that traced family bloodlines back at least 3 generations. Blue eyes, blonde hair, straight noses, and Germanic bone structure were more valuable than education, curiosity, or dreams. The goal was to filter out those who didn't fit the racial mold. Once selected, the girls were brought into large houses, often located in peaceful settings, lakesides, forests, or quiet suburbs. There they lived together for 6 weeks in groups of 20. The homes resembled boarding schools on the outside, but inside the curriculum was far from ordinary. Every day was structured, controlled, and purposeful. Morning exercises were followed by lessons in cooking, cleaning, sewing, and childcare. They were taught how to manage a household down to the smallest detail, how to iron a uniform, how to set a proper SS dinner table, how to raise healthy children according to Nazi ideals. But domestic skills were only the beginning. These schools were also centers of ideological training. The girls were taught about racial purity, genetics, and eugenics. They learned which traits were desirable and which were degenerate. They were trained to see themselves as guardians of the Aryan race, responsible for giving birth to the next generation of Germans, strong, pure, and loyal. Religion was quietly removed from the classroom. In its place came a new form of spiritual guidance. Hitler replaced God. Loyalty to the Führer was described as the highest moral value. At bedtime, the girls were expected to recite prayers, not to heaven, but to Hitler. One common version began with the words, "My Führer, I know you well and love you like my father and mother." Slowly, day by day, their private thoughts and personal beliefs were replaced with scripts written by the state. Marriage, too, was redefined. It was no longer a personal bond between two people, but a public demonstration of loyalty to the regime. Hitler insisted on replacing Christian weddings with Eiweihen, SS marriage rituals that had more in common with pagan rites than with church traditions. These ceremonies were held in front of party officials, under oak leaf altars decorated with SS insignias. The couple exchanged silver rings engraved with ancient Germanic runes. On many cakes, a sugar figurine of Hitler replaced the traditional bride and groom. The symbolism was powerful and precise. From the moment a woman entered the bride school to the moment she said her vows, her life was being shaped, not by love, but by ideology. Her future was carefully scripted, and every choice narrowed until only one path remained: obedience. After marriage came the next command. In Nazi Germany, giving birth was no longer a private choice, it became a public duty. The regime called it the law for the encouragement of marriage. Passed in 1933, it offered newlywed couples a generous state loan, 1,000 Reichmarks, enough to furnish a home and begin a life together. But it came with a condition. For every child a couple produced, a quarter of the loan was forgiven. By the fourth child, the debt vanished. Those who gave birth were not just praised, they were decorated. The Mother's Cross was the Reich's version of a Medal of Honor. Bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, gold for 8. It was awarded once a year on Mother's Day, in ceremonies that felt more military than maternal. But not every mother was eligible. Only Aryan women, healthy, obedient, racially pure, were allowed to be celebrated. The womb had become a battlefield, but only the right women were called to fight. Propaganda painted these women as national heroines. Posters showed radiant mothers surrounded by smiling children, sunlight falling on tidy homes. But behind those images was control. Being a good mother in Nazi Germany meant more than bearing children. It meant bearing them in the right way. Hygiene was monitored, diets were regulated, clothing had to be modest, hairstyles simple, makeup discouraged. What entered the body, what left it, what was whispered to a child before sleep, none of it belonged to the woman anymore. Everything had to serve the nation. There was no space for hesitation, and even less for prevention. The regime banned contraception for Aryan women, birth control was declared unnatural. Family planning was condemned as selfish. The only future allowed was a fertile one. An abortion, unless forced by illness or danger, was a crime. But this moral stance had sharp limits. For Jewish women, Slavic women, and others labeled as undesirable, abortion was encouraged and even ordered. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler introduced a new program, Lebensborn, the Fountain of Life. At first it was described as a charitable organization to help struggling mothers. In truth, it was a carefully managed system to produce racially ideal children. Special birthing homes were created across Germany and later across occupied Europe. These homes were not open to everyone. Only young, unmarried women who passed strict racial tests could enter. They were welcome, protected and cared for, but only if their bloodline was clean. Inside they carried the children of SS officers, sometimes through relationships, sometimes through arrangement. Legitimacy no longer mattered, only the purity of the child. The state encouraged these births. In the eyes of the regime, having a child with a soldier was an act of national service. The homes were quiet and well furnished, often using property stolen from Jewish families sent to the camps. The women were told they were special and chosen, but even here their bodies were not their own. From the moment they walked through the door, they belonged to something larger and colder than family. They were vessels, nothing more, and when the baby was born, it was often taken and raised by the state, or adopted by SS families. While ordinary women across Nazi Germany were being shaped by strict rules, wearing modest dresses, avoiding makeup, raising children in quiet homes filled with ideology, another group of women was living by a different standard. They were the wives of the regime's elite, and though they were expected to embody the same values of obedience and motherhood, their reality looked very different. Behind the polished doors of their villas, these women moved through halls of luxury, surrounded by art, silk, and servants. But even there, inside those grand homes, the regime watched. Even privilege had its limits. Magda Goebbels, the wife of Joseph Goebbels, was the most famous of them all. She was elegant, articulate, and adored by Hitler himself. Many saw her as the First Lady of the Reich, not because she held any official title, but because she knew how to play the role. She smiled at the right moment, raised 6 blonde-haired children, and stood quietly beside her husband in public. But she was not just a symbol, she was a believer, a woman who wrapped herself in ideology as tightly as she did in luxury. She had grown up surrounded by contradiction. Her early years were shaped by wealth, abandonment, and even a brief romantic connection to a young Jewish Zionist. But once she stepped into Hitler's circle, she never looked back. Magda Goebbels became more than just the wife of the propaganda minister. She became a propaganda figure herself. Her image was everywhere, a radiant mother dressed in perfect simplicity, surrounded by her children. The newspapers called her the model of German womanhood, but outside the camera's frame, the reality was more complex. Magda lived in mansions designed by Albert Speer. Her homes were filled with expensive furniture and stolen art. She entertained foreign dignitaries with fine wine and flawless charm. While other women were forbidden to wear French fashion, she owned tailored pieces and elegant shoes. While bride school students learned how to scrub boots and bake bread, she spent summers at lakeside villas with private staff. Still, she knew the rules. Even from a pedestal, she had to serve the Reich. Magda Goebbels walked the narrow line between privilege and performance. She played the part of mother, wife, and party loyalist to perfection, but the expectations never left her. She was watched just as closely as those women in apron and uniforms. And when her marriage faltered, when Joseph Goebbels' affairs threatened to become scandalous, it was Hitler himself who stepped in. He didn't let the couple separate. The illusion had to be maintained. The Reich needed its perfect family. Magda obeyed. She always did. In private she suffered, but in public she smiled. But Magda Goebbels was not the only woman who turned obedience into spectacle. She was not the only one who trapped ideology in silk and lace. Beside her was another figure, Emmy Göring, actress turned wife of Hermann Göring, a woman who transformed herself into a symbol of Nazi aristocracy. If Magda was the mother of the Reich, Emmy was its star. And like any star, she knew how to dazzle, how to dominate a room, how to leave an impression that lasted longer than applause. She entered the spotlight with elegance, bringing with her the poise of a theatre actress and the ambition of someone who understood the weight of image. When she married Göring in a grand ceremony in 1935, the pictures were splashed across the newspapers. The Berlin Cathedral, the uniforms, the flowers. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a message. Power had a new face, and it wore pearls. But Emmy was not content to stand quietly beside her husband. She wanted more than just a title. She wanted a crown, and for a time she wore one. She was Hitler's favoured hostess at official events. Her job was not to just pour champagne or smile for photographers. She was meant to represent the ideal of Nazi femininity, elevated to a level that few others could reach. Her presence was performance. Her life was the stage. And what a life it was. While ordinary women were being told to raise children in quiet homes, Emmy moved through marble hallways and velvet-draped salons. Her dresses shimmered, her dinners sparkled with silver cutlery and stolen art. She lived in estates with names like Karen Hall and Emmy Hall, hosted foreign dignitaries, and watched the world from private balconies. When her daughter was born, Hermann Göring ordered 500 warplanes to fly over Berlin in celebration. Like Magda, Emmy followed the rules on the surface, smiled when she needed, raised her daughter, played the perfect hostess, but behind the beauty was a deeper role. She became the face of power in a regime that stripped others of everything. She lived in luxury while others starved. She posed for photographs while others were erased. But even among the elite, Emmy stood apart. She saw herself as royalty and behaved accordingly. She looked down on others who did not share her elegance, especially Eva Braun, whom she openly disrespected. That arrogance cost her. Hitler, angry at her treatment of his companion, eventually excluded her from his private circles. but by then Emmy's image had already taken root. She had already made her mark. And speaking of Eva Braun, it is impossible to tell the story of Nazi womanhood without her. She was not a mother, not a hostess, not a public face of the regime, and yet she was always there, a figure in the background, a quiet presence beside the most powerful man in Germany. She lived at the heart of the Reich, yet remained invisible to the world until it was too late. Mysterious, elusive, and carefully hidden from the public eye, Eva Braun was Hitler's closest companion and his final bride. She first met him as a teenager working in the Munich studio of Hitler's personal photographer. He was over 40, already known, already dangerous, but to her he was charming. She called him Herr Wolf. He called her his little treasure. From the very beginning, their relationship was built on secrecy. He kept her hidden, out of photographs, out of speeches, out of sight. Not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted to appear unmarried, untied, fully devoted to Germany. Marriage to Hitler was a weakness. Romance was a distraction. Eva Braun was an exception, he never admitted. But she was not just a decoration. She lived inside his world. At the Berghof, in his Munich apartment, later in the bunker beneath Berlin, she attended dinners, watched films, and sunbathed on balconies. She laughed, danced, and posed for pictures, and behind the scenes she understood exactly how much power she had. She knew who to speak to, who to avoid, and when to make herself heard. She was not included in political decisions, but she understood their shape. And though the men around her mocked her as simple or shallow, she remained, as always, by Hitler's side. Eva had her own staff, her own apartments, her own photographers. She collected footage of Hitler's inner circle, selling it to trusted sources, controlling how history would remember her. She smiled in every frame, but her life was anything but light. She had attempted suicide twice before being finally accepted into Hitler's private life. And though she lived in luxury, her world was tightly managed. She was free to move within its walls, but never beyond them. She was not invited to strategy meetings. She did not attend rallies. She was kept away from ministers, generals, and plans, and yet she belonged to that world more than most. When the regime began to collapse, when bombs fell on Berlin and the walls of the bunker shook, she chose to stay. She had waited 14 years to be called his wife. She received that title only hours before her death. Ironically, the man who built an empire on motherhood, who praised fertility and demanded children from every corner of the Reich, left no heirs. He and Eva Braun had no children, but in the eyes of the regime she still embodied one of its most exalted ideals. She remained loyal, silent, obedient, and forever in his shadow. She never questioned, never left, never demanded a life of her own. In the end, she gave what the ideology valued most: complete devotion. She followed her husband into death, not as a mother of the Reich, but as the ultimate symbol of sacrifice.